Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching The Big Picture with me, Frank Rajan Pereira. One of the lessons to be learned from the novel coronavirus pandemic is the nations should build supply chains inside the country. Even US President Donald Trump stressed on this aspect. Trump's remarks assume significance amid the disruption in the supply chain and the world's dependence on other countries on items of basic necessities, including pharmaceuticals, including the anti-malarial drug hydroxychloroquine that is cited by Trump as a viable therapeutic to the deadly COVID-19. On this edition of The Big Picture, we will analyze how to restore global supply chains. Joining me on the program today are Rajan Sudesh Ratna, Economic Affairs Officer, United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, Charan Singh, CEO, EGROW Foundation, and Subhomoy Bhattacharjee, Consulting Editor of the Business Standard. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of The Big Picture. Professor, let me begin the program with you. Let's first try and understand and try and analyze the kind of impact that the global supply chains has seen as a result of the coronavirus pandemic.
First of all, Frank, I must congratulate you for bringing up this topic in this discussion. It's very, very important. I have been writing on this now for a couple of weeks. Actually, if you look at it from the angle of economics, monopoly has never been considered to be a good practice. A monopolist can dictate prices and can also hurt the markets. In banking, you would have heard about this concept called concentration of assets. In our daily life, we always talk about it, don't put all your eggs in the same basket. It is amazing when it comes to global geopolitics. The production hub of the whole world was in China. Now just imagine something happens to a single country, what happens to the supply chain across the world? To give you an illustration, in 1978, there were hardly any or probably no multinational operating in China. And when they opened in 1980, there were about 100 foreign companies working in China. You will be surprised. Today, there are more than 9 lakh companies operating in China. So the back offices, the production centers, manufacturing, all that has got concentrated into China. Now, once you see this happening, the virus and the critical situation, it is obvious two things will happen. Firstly, supply disruption in China because of the manufacturing stopping there. The other is the visitors not keen to go into China and strike new deals. So that is why across the world, there was this situation on on medicines, on travel, on tourism, on manufacturing, even on infrastructure. And you know, a country like India, all our festivals, our greeting cards, our lighting arrangements, our equipment comes from there. Now just imagine this across the world. Textiles, engineering goods, everything got disrupted. So I think it's good that the world has woken up. It's good that the monopoly power in production in one single country is now being challenged. It's good that America, the biggest power, the economic power on the planet, is talking about it. But then now, you know what I'm very worried about? I'm very worried. If you go back into the 60s and 70s, the world was not as well integrated as it is. The theory of international trade saying that you should move labor and goods and services across the planet and you can optimize your resources, that is probably going to get a setback for some time. And everybody is going to go back into their shell, and that multipolarism or the multinationalism that we had seen, I would see probably a reversal in it. Every country will try to build the supply chain within the country itself, at least of essential commodities, some medicines, some infrastructure. So there is a worry that the world is going to go back into their shell, and I do not know what's going to happen to international trade.
Okay, all right. So Rajan Ratna, since we are here, I must ask you this question. So what happens then to global integration, and what happens to globalization as a whole going forward?
Thanks for this topic, and thank you for inviting me for this. It is a very important issue. Let's accept one reality. present crisis is an unprecedented crisis which world perhaps has never seen like this. Many of us compare it with the global economic recession of 2008 and subsequently. I think it's much more graver than that because there are a lot of lives, more than 100,000 lives have all around the world people have seen. I don't know, these are all reported figures. God knows how many of them are infected. The second, if you see the trends, the global trade has fallen down. And the WTO has come out with a report stating therein that for 2020, the world trade will see a downfall of something ranging from 13% to 32%. That is what is the global scenario. IMF only a week ago has forecasted 3% economic slowdown and equivalent to $9 trillion of output. Now, these figures are alarming because they will surely jeopardize economic activities of many countries. Realignments may happen. The thrust on self-sufficiency may be one of the tools which many of the governments would like to intervene through the policy interventions. But as Professor Singh said, it's not easy to change the global dynamics overnight. Right now, we do not know when the effect of coronavirus will be totally neutralized. It may be 2 months from now, it may be 3 months from now. So half of year is already gone by then. And then the countries will try to recover. In the process of recovery, the first effort of every nation would be to see how best their demand and supply within the country is established, how the connectivities which were broken through, essential commodities only being allowed to be transported from one place to another place. And I'm not talking about cross-border. Borders are also sealed. I was just reading one of these reports and I found, after this COVID, when you are doing these shipment, the air cargo. Now, air cargo, many of the time, these shipment will go through the passenger flight. And after, if you compare from the October 19 prices, there is a rise in 30% of the price. If you are talking about a cargo flight which is taking place from China to North America. If you look at the cargo price, it has gone up 60% between Europe and America. And obviously so, because number one, you have put these restrictions for movement of, vessels, cargo, shipping, air cargo across the border. Now, under these circumstances, this is also a fact that the global supply chains have been affected in a negative sense. But the inventories are there with every country, because if you are doing a business, you will definitely have some inventory. The spillover effect of this will be felt maybe a couple of months from now on. Right. And right now, when the government is all talking about food and medical and health supply, etc., slowly this chain, if this coronavirus continues and if these restrictions are continued for another 3 months, then even the global supply will see the problem. And that's why I'm saying in 2008, it was only market-driven, recession. This time, it's both demand and supply which is going to be negatively affected because of that.
Absolutely, absolutely. All right, Subhomoy, I'm going to take this particular aspect with you forward, the issue of demand and supply. If you look at the oil market, it's a completely different scenario where, we've never seen something like this ever happen, where oil prices have gone into the negative, especially Brent. Now, if you talk about spillover effect, this is another spillover effect that we are looking at. I mean, these are crazy times, aren't they?
I mean, they couldn't be more crazier, but probably they'll be even more crazy for all you know. But yeah, it's totally unprecedented. And essentially what's happening is not only is the global supply chain disrupted, because countries do not now trust each other. It's also that the system, the plumbing which runs the global supply chain, that has also got disrupted. Both the financial as well as you pointed out, the oil sector, the transportation links. So in a way, all of these will have to be reconstructed once a semblance of normality comes across in different countries. The big problem that comes along is that we have never done this at one go. Gradually, as countries got into the supply chain, as the demand of the world rose, various parts came together. It's suddenly as if all the parts have been dismantled and somebody has to put it together. WTO, frankly, or if you say IMF, they don't have the capacity just by themselves to be able to do it. Can they join forces to be able to do it? We don't know because they have never tried it. And frankly speaking, there is no rule book again to be able to tell us that how this can be done and which comes ahead, which comes later. Like, for instance, if the shipping lines are disrupted, then do we first try to restore the health of the shipping systems, or do we try to put the production lines initially first and start the production process going, hoping that the time that is there will allow for the shipping lines to be repaired and to be brought onto the sea? So there's a lot. And financial sector, I'm not even talking about the shock that each of the major banks across the world have gone through in terms of what is on the balance sheet. So this reconstructing of the supply chain, I mean, we don't even have to say that countries will be today in a shell. It is evident they'll be in shell because there is no assured system of supply that is coming through. For instance, let me give an example. Not many people might know that in Bombay port now, every consignment that is coming from China is being fumigated. The cost of fumigation, as well as the process of doing it, takes so much of time that itself is a cost, additional cost. Secondly, the supply that is coming out there, many companies are not willing to take that supply. They are actually petitioning the government for demurrage charges to be lowered so that they don't have to take the supply of those goods because the markets are not there. And there's an example of India, this is an example across the world. So there are so many moving parts that have got disrupted that you're absolutely right, Frank, that countries for the time being will be in a shell, and both demand and supply will take time to be reconstructed. How many quarters is a question that lots of modeling can be done. Professor Singh can do it, Rajiv can do it, in terms of trying to figure out when this will happen and when we might get a sequence relatively in place for the flows to come into in sort of a balance.
Okay, right. So, Professor, since we are here, so how do we restore global supply chains? Do you see that happening anytime soon? What is the process that needs to be followed? What do you see happening in the next few months?
So I must confess right at the outset that I had an opportunity to work at the IMF, and I was working in Washington, DC. And now, when I look at their global financial stability report, I look at their World Economic Outlook, all so pessimistic, so pessimistic. Now, I have been tweeting about it and saying, you have enjoyed the multilateralism. You are, at the end of the day, the International Monetary Fund. Is this the time to be pessimist? Or, and I have written in one of my tweets where I mentioned that you have documented gloom very well. But I'm not looking at gloom from you. I'm looking for solutions from you. So, as we have just discussed, we know everybody is going to retire into their shell. There's a lockdown taking place. Now, before I go further, I'd like to point out two things to you. One, in 2008 crisis, there was a contagion. The epicenter was America, and from there it traveled to Europe. And at that time, if you remember, there was this new concept which was invented, the decoupling of the economy. India will decouple from the US and therefore nothing will happen. And that was not possible. We are globally integrated, and through the contagion, it came to us sooner or later. But one thing that was important in 2008 was it was not a simultaneous lockdown of the global economy. What has happened now is a simultaneous lockdown. There's a lockdown in Los Angeles, there's a lockdown in India, there's a lockdown in England, everything happening at the same time. The only country where the lockdown is not taking place is China. Now the issue is this really that bad? Yes, there is no precedent. Even if you look at the older pandemics, 1918 and prior to that, the world was not as globalized, as integrated as it is today. The world today is integrated in various ways. The goods were integrated, manpower is integrated, financial resources are integrated, spillovers happen instantaneously. The oil phenomena which was just being mentioned, just imagine nobody knows what to do with oil and they are giving it at zero price. Last night I was awake. The price of oil had gone down to minus $35 a barrel. Minus $35 a barrel. It recovered. By the time I got up in the morning, it was selling at $0. Now the issue is, how do we revive it? This is the scenario, unparalleled, unprecedented. The multilateral institutions like the World Bank and the IMF, the Bank for International Settlement, they have to swing into action and prepare a roadmap. Now, what should that roadmap be? Now, this is not a standard thing. It's not a clerical exercise. It's not a modeling exercise which is taught in universities where you know something has happened and you. This is an unprecedented, never ever before it has happened. Now, how do you go about? So my little strategy on this is the multilateral institutions like the IMF and the World Bank will have to sit together with the countries and not paint a gloomy picture. They have to say, no, we have to recover. Now we are looking at a recovery path. Then the issue is, what should I start doing? Should I set the transport agency first or should I start the production first? It is obvious. And going back to the old days, when you produce, you consume inputs. You're paying the supplier, you are producing something, you're paying the daily wages, you're paying your employees, you're creating demand at both ends, and then you're producing something which they consume. So I think the push has to come to production. Let's start production. Once we start production, where do we do it now? China, there's no lockdown. Should we continue with China? There's enough hard sentiments now which they say they've burned their fingers and they want to move out. If they want to move out, it has to be done rapidly and quickly. In such situations where production has to start, only then everything else falls in place. For example, agriculture production starts, then everything sets into place. You need somebody to buy the wheat, you need somebody to transport the wheat to the consumer, and a complete cycle starts. The nature gives you the crop, and then the whole cycle starts, production starts. Now, where will the production start? My suggestion has been, India is the most viable country in terms of size, both geographical size and the available labor force. The labor force is generally skilled, spoken English is good, people are democratic, country is very vast, there are virgin areas in Northeast, there are industrial hubs in Gujarat and Maharashtra, the producing houses, if they are looking for alternatives, India should pitch for it, use its embassies to tell the world, here are we. As we gave land to some companies, car companies here and there, we should be able to create cities for industries to come here, quickly settle down and start producing. How much time will it take?
Let me take that particular point forward. So basically you're suggesting that, India is in prime position really to take advantage of this situation, and India should propagate that, take it to the world, and ensure we use this particular method going forward. All right. So, Rajan, Ratna, talking about solutions, it's very clear. It's I think we've made it a point on this program itself that these are unprecedented times. Things will never ever be the same again going forward. We all know that. So considering all of this, what kind of solutions do we need to see going forward?
Frank, frankly speaking, there are a few things or certain steps which we need to, every country need to take. One would be the short term, another would be the long term. Now, howsoever a country may try to, attract the investments and manufacturing new to come, please let's take certain realities. India, let's take the case for pharmaceutical, right? India is known in the world for generic drugs. Now, we are the world leaders, and we have seen many countries, including Trump, demanding India to supply them, and there were a lot of things which were written in the newspaper. But where do we get these APIs? Where do we get the bulk drug to prepare these medicines? It comes from China. India doesn't have a self-sufficiency. Now, can in 3 months' time we become self-sufficient? Is it possible? I don't see this is going to be possible. It takes time. It will take time. And that is where both the government and the private sector, or a public sector, which I know IDPL was there long ago when they were trying to produce bulk drug, but it was unsuccessful in India. So that is one aspect. The second aspect, while I am slightly inclined to agree to Professor, many of the private sector which has invested in China have not invested only because of the sentimental value. They have invested because there was an economics in making profit ultimately. Now, when you say it has to come to India, it will not come to India just because China has gone bad and everybody is saying, oh, China is the worst enemy of the world for making this pandemic. No, that is not how it will happen. There are many things which you need to improve in India. Oh, we have very good labor, but do we have efficient labor laws? What is the cost of electricity which you pay in India? What is the fiscal incentive from our private sector when you compare their interest rate for doing a business with other competing countries? I mean, Vietnam has done much more better. So if somebody will have to pull up the investment from China, they will like to put it up in some country which already has a policy and enabling environment in place, rather than going into a country where there is a tentativeness. And that is where the role of a government comes into in a very important way. This is the time, with success, there are very little chances of learning.
Right.
But with bad experiences, you learn. I think I don't see it as pessimism. I see it as optimism. India every time has brought the policy reforms, whether it is 1991 or even subsequently, only when we were challenged. We were in a grave and a difficult situation. And this is the time when perhaps India can bring in domestic policies in a manner. Of course, very recently, RBI also came up and they did some fiscal incentive, but I don't think that is very sufficient to attract investments to come in. Okay. The second one thing is also about the supply chain when you are talking about. There are enough reports which say if you have to make a consignment go from one place of India to another place, it's more expensive than shipping it from India to Thailand or Hong Kong. Now, how do you think you can become a part of a supply chain with this kind of aberrations in the country?
Okay, points taken. Points taken. Let me take that particular aspect forward. So we are now staring at a very grave and difficult situation, Subhomoy. So can India take advantage of this particular situation?
It can always take. What Rajan is saying is absolutely correct. It can take, provided we do the factor reforms that is needed for us to be able to take advantage. Intentions are good, but intentions will just not help unless we bring in the series of reforms that are needed to make the companies set up business here. So that's one point. The other thing is that essentially, right now, Indian industry has to first, even before it starts thinking about the world economy, has to first start get its own production for even the domestic market back into shape. There's been a lot of buffeting. Let's see how many of the manufacturing sector companies, services sector is in fact is still some way off because there's a social distancing and so many other problems. So let's see how much of the manufacturing sector companies are able to get their production just up to 100% or in any time frame. Once that starts happening, it's only then that industry abroad will start getting interested in locking onto India. Because basically the manufacturing sector industry in India for the last few decades has essentially been shrinking, and that's not a good news for anybody who wants to come in from abroad. So for us to be able to take advantage, the domestic manufacturing sector has to show that it's actually an interesting place to work. So these are the stuff that would be needed. And one of the first things, as I said, is basically the financial sector, getting the money flow, liquidity going through the economy. One good thing is that of late credit, which had got seized up, has started flowing in again. But the SME sector, that would be a very important cog in the entire development process. That needs to come back to life, and that's going. And frankly speaking, again, it is right now we don't know the extent of damage to the SME sector. So how fast it will come back would be a very good measure of how fast India can start thinking of being a manufacturing center, which can actually start producing goods on a vast scale. There are lots of these stuff that needs to be sorted through. I would say that this year is a great year for us just to get the rules of the game properly worked out between industry and the government. Till the COVID outbreak happened, industry was battling heavily against RCEP. Today, if we want to be part of the world manufacturing center, we can't jolly well say that we shall be staying out of the global supply chain, the global value chain. If we are interested, then we have to necessarily forget about China. Let's get more integrated with the ASEAN countries. Right. And that means signing a some trade agreement. Indian industry has a very strong opposition to many of these trade agreements. And those are the sort of stuff that we shall now need to sort through very carefully and very fast, looking at this as an advantage. I agree that many of reforms get done when there's a crisis. And hopefully this will be a wonderful time to get all those efforts into place so that we are able to enter the global value chain as a significant player.
Okay, time now to get quick closing comments from all my guests. I've got very limited time on the program. I've got less than 2 minutes, so I'm going to ask you to be brief. 30 seconds each, please, concluding remarks on the best way forward. Starting first with you, Professor.
So, I'm very clear on it. The trade associations, 3 of them, one of them more than 100 years old, should be taken along to help us get industry from across the world to come and set up shop here. Secondly, we have a booming stock market, a rare thing in the rest of the world. We should take advantage of that. We already have experience in setting up export processing zones. They are like islands. We could set up those cities where we can invite foreign investment, foreign production, and say you will have world-class infrastructure and world-class laws which will be applied there. And I think multilateral institutions should be tapped to say India is an alternative. We should market ourselves to the world and say, right, welcome India.
Okay, all right. Rajan, Ratna?
Okay, what I think the policymakers, the government of India and the private sector, through consultation, first they need to focus on identify sectors. You cannot get investment coming into all the sectors. So you need to focus on which sectors, and then the policy interventions would need to be made, which is a sector specific. Maybe SEZs can play a better role in reviving Indian economy, because we are talking also about a global supply chain establishment. They have a lot of space right now to use it. And fiscal and some of the labor, especially in case of India, which has a lot of informal labor, which has been displaced because of the present COVID crisis.
Okay, all right. And Subhomoy, close the show for us with your concluding remarks.
Yeah, these are all hopeful ideas. SEZ's great idea. Bringing trade associations to the world is a great idea, provided we are seen to be doing our part in terms of getting the world to see us as an interesting place. So essentially, there should be a lot of cleaning up, which we should be doing. We have started doing it in the agricultural sector. The mandis have been they've been starting to bypass the mandis to allow farmers to go directly to the producers. That's a good idea. That sort of stuff we should be doing in other places also.
Okay, all right. On that note, then we'll call it a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. That's it from me. See you again next time.